David Miller had never thought of himself as a particularly sentimental man, but the weathered barn that stood at the edge of his newly purchased property stirred something in him he couldn't quite define. Most people who drove by the land saw nothing more than a decaying structure, its roof sagging in places, the boards gray with age, and the wide doors permanently askew after decades of storms and neglect. To David, however, the barn was not an eyesore but a remnant of character, the kind of rough, imperfect shape that carried history in its beams and lent a strange dignity to the surrounding fields. He was an architect by profession, though not the kind who reveled in glossy magazines and luxury projects. He was fascinated by the dialogue between old and new, by the way a structure could remain part of the landscape even as everything around it changed. The barn, with its stubborn refusal to collapse completely, spoke to him more than any pristine modern building ever could. When he had first walked the property with the real estate agent, she had laughed lightly and said that most buyers would simply have the barn torn down to clear space for expansion, but David had only shaken his head. He already imagined integrating it into his future plans, perhaps stabilizing the frame, repairing the roof, and using the interior as a workshop where he could sketch, model, and retreat from the noise of his professional life. He pictured tall windows cut into the wooden walls, shafts of sunlight falling across drafting tables, and the smell of timber mingling with the faint scent of oil from his tools. The barn would not be discarded, it would be reborn, a foundation for something both personal and functional. The first weeks after moving in had been consumed by paperwork, unpacking, and endless calls with contractors about the house itself, which needed renovations before he could even think of long-term plans for the outbuildings. Still, every evening he found himself wandering toward the barn, touching the rough grain of the boards and listening to the way the structure creaked against the wind, as if whispering its resistance to time. He made mental notes about what needed reinforcement, which beams could be salvaged, and which parts would require replacement. Some nights he sat on the grass with a thermos of coffee, sketching quick perspectives of how the barn could evolve, how its outline would merge with a more modern silhouette once he started the work. There was also, though he rarely admitted it aloud, a deeper reason he valued the barn. David's father had been a craftsman who never left behind wealth but who taught his son to respect tools, to repair rather than discard, to see potential where others saw waste. The barn reminded David of the small workshop his father had kept behind their family home, a place filled with sawdust and the smell of varnish, where long conversations had been woven into the rhythm of hammer strikes and the hiss of sandpaper. Though the old workshop was long gone, reduced to nothing more than a memory and a box of rusted tools, the barn seemed to echo those same lessons: patience, endurance, the quiet dignity of usefulness. Preserving it felt like preserving a fragment of his father's voice. David was not a man who sought constant company. He worked from home whenever possible, preferring the solitude that allowed his mind to wander freely through designs and drawings without interruption. The barn, in that sense, was perfect. It was separate from the main house, distant enough to feel like another world but close enough to walk to whenever inspiration called. He believed, perhaps stubbornly, that it was not only possible but necessary to create spaces that reflected continuity, places where memory and practicality coexisted without one erasing the other. As winter gave way to spring, David finally began putting together a schedule for the renovation. He set aside a portion of his budget, modest compared to the scale of the projects he handled professionally, but sufficient for the careful restoration he envisioned. He even found a small local firm willing to help with structural reinforcement once the weather improved. Everything felt aligned, as though the barn had patiently waited for someone who would not see it as disposable. Standing before it one crisp morning, David traced the jagged outline of the roof against the pale sky and thought about how unusual it was that such a structure still stood. Entire developments had sprung up around properties like this, swallowing fields and flattening whatever remnants of the past remained. But here, at least for now, the barn endured. He promised himself that no matter how much effort it demanded, he would keep it standing. To him, it was more than just an old building. It was the anchor of his property, the part that gave meaning to everything else. In his mind, he had already woven it into his future. The barn was not an afterthought, nor a temporary inconvenience. It was the beginning. It was a late afternoon in early May when David first realized something was terribly wrong. He had been in town for most of the day, meeting with a client and running errands, and as he drove back toward his property, he was thinking absently about what groceries he might prepare for dinner. The road curved as it always did, leading him past the neighboring lot owned by Mark Peterson, a man David had only exchanged pleasantries with on a few occasions. Mark was loud and gregarious, the kind of neighbor who thrived on backyard parties with blaring music and trucks parked haphazardly on the grass, a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice and always seemed to have an audience for it. David, in contrast, had kept interactions with him minimal, not out of hostility but because he valued peace, and Mark radiated the opposite. Their properties shared a long border, and although David had noticed Mark occasionally eyeing his barn with what looked like disdain, he had never imagined it could amount to anything more than casual annoyance. As David turned into his own driveway, his first thought was that he had somehow lost his bearings. The familiar silhouette of the barn, which always marked the edge of his land like a steadfast sentinel, was gone. For a few disoriented seconds he wondered if he was simply looking from the wrong angle, if the light had obscured it, but the truth struck him as he parked the car and stepped out into the warm, dust-scented air. The barn was not there. In its place was a wide patch of flattened earth, the soil freshly churned and pressed down by heavy machinery. A faint smell of diesel still lingered in the air, and scattered about were broken boards and twisted metal hinges, thrown into a rough pile as though the demolition had been performed carelessly and without any attempt at respect for what had once stood. David felt his stomach lurch, a hollow wave of disbelief coursing through him as he walked closer. He touched the broken timbers at the edge of the debris, recognizing pieces of the doorframe, shards of the very boards he had run his hands across only a few nights earlier. The sight was not just a surprise, it was a violation, a brutal intrusion on his vision of what his home was supposed to be. He stood frozen, the quiet of the property pressing heavily against him, until the sound of footsteps on gravel broke his daze. From the far side of the lot, Mark Peterson strolled toward him with an air of casual pride, wiping his hands on a rag as though he had just finished a job well done. He wore his usual smug grin, the kind that made every sentence he spoke feel like a provocation. "Well, David," he called out, his voice carrying too easily across the empty space, "I guess you got home just in time to see the cleanup. You can thank me later." David blinked at him, the words not computing. "What did you do?" His voice came out low, strained with disbelief rather than anger, because the idea that his neighbor might have torn down his barn seemed too absurd to accept. Mark gestured at the flattened earth with a flourish. "That old shack was a hazard, friend. Falling apart, leaning all over the place, could have come down in the next storm and crushed someone. Honestly, I was doing you a favor. Figured I'd clear it out for you. Place looks better already, doesn't it?" The casual tone, the twisted framing of his destruction as a kind of generosity, hit David like a slap. He shook his head slowly. "That was my barn, on my property. You had no right." Instead of apologizing, Mark chuckled. "Well, see, that's the thing. I checked some maps, and from what I could tell, that barn was straddling my boundary. Half of it on your side, half of it on mine. Real mess of a placement, to be honest. So I figured I'd just handle it. And don't worry, I'll make it easy for you. I rented the equipment, had some of my guys bring it down quick. Only fair, you cover the costs. We'll call it even." For a moment, David could not breathe. It wasn't just the destruction. It was the brazen arrogance, the inversion of victim and culprit. He stared at Mark, whose grin widened as though daring him to protest. Finally, David found his voice, sharper now. "You expect me to pay you for demolishing my property?" "Of course," Mark replied smoothly, as though the idea were obvious. "You'd have had to pay someone to get rid of that heap eventually. I just saved you the trouble. All I'm asking is reimbursement, equipment rental, labor, fuel. We're neighbors, after all. Let's keep it friendly." The word friendly felt poisoned. David's hands clenched at his sides as he fought the urge to shout. He could already sense that outrage would only fuel Mark's smug performance. Still, the anger surged in his chest, mingling with the deeper violation of seeing his vision, his heritage, reduced to splinters and dirt without his consent. "You destroyed something that mattered to me," he said finally, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "This isn't about costs. You had no authority to touch it. None." "I'll be contacting the authorities." Mark shrugged as though the threat amused him. "Suit yourself, but I've been around here a long time. And trust me, folks know that barn was a hazard. I doubt anyone's going to weep over it being gone. Besides, paperwork's messy in this area. Boundaries shift, old surveys don't line up. You'll find it hard to prove where that barn really sat. I've got copies that show it's been nudging into my land for years. So if you want to make a fight of it, be ready for a headache. And, in the meantime, you still owe me for the bulldozer." The gall of it left David reeling. He could feel the careful order of his life tilting off balance, the certainty he had about his plans for the property crumbling along with the barn itself. In its place, there was only chaos, an abrupt awareness that his neighbor had no respect for boundaries, legal, physical, or moral. As Mark sauntered back toward his own house, whistling as if nothing serious had happened, David remained rooted to the spot, staring at the desecrated ground. He realized, with a clarity that chilled him, that this was not a mistake. It had never been about confusion or goodwill. Mark had acted deliberately, and now he was twisting the narrative to make David the one in debt. The barn, once a symbol of continuity and purpose, had been reduced to rubble, and in its place stood the first marker of a conflict David had not sought but could no longer avoid. The following days unfolded with a disorienting mix of silence and hostility, as if the absence of the barn had created a vacuum on David's property that his neighbor was eager to fill. At first, David had convinced himself that the obvious course of action was to involve the police and let the authorities handle what was so clearly a case of vandalism and trespass. When he walked into the small station downtown, carrying photographs of the demolition site and his deed to the property, he had expected at least a semblance of concern. Instead, the officer behind the desk listened with half-interest, jotting down a few notes before explaining in a measured but dismissive tone that disputes over property boundaries were civil matters, not typically handled by law enforcement. Unless immediate danger was involved. David pressed, pointing out that his neighbor had not only trespassed but destroyed a structure without permission, yet the officer only repeated that he would need to resolve it through court channels. The message was clear. He was on his own. The futility of that first attempt left David simmering with frustration, and he returned home to find an envelope taped to his front door. Inside was a typed letter, complete with a crude invoice that listed costs for demolition services, equipment rental, and even debris management. At the bottom was Mark's looping signature and a handwritten note. "Let's avoid dragging this out. Settle quickly, and we can both move on." The audacity of seeing his loss reduced to a bill made David's chest tighten with disbelief. He crumpled the paper, only to smooth it out again and photograph it for his records. If nothing else, it was evidence of his neighbor's brazen attempt to reframe the crime as a business arrangement. In the days that followed, the tension rippled outward. David noticed subtle shifts in the way some neighbors interacted with him. One afternoon at the small grocery store, a woman from 2 houses down gave him a sympathetic but guarded look before muttering something about how that barn was dangerous anyway. Another man, someone David had never spoken to before, remarked, casually as he passed in the parking lot. "Heard your building was over the line. Rough luck." It did not take long to trace the source. Mark, with his effortless charm and steady presence in every casual gathering, had already begun spreading his version of the story. He told people he had taken it upon himself to address a safety hazard, that the barn was partly on his land, and that David was making a fuss rather than appreciating his help. Each comment reinforced the realization that David was not merely contending with a private grievance. He was fighting a narrative, one that threatened to paint him as unreasonable or even ungrateful. The barn had been more than a pile of wood, but Mark's version reduced it to an eyesore, a liability, a nuisance eradicated for the benefit of the community. What unsettled David most was how easily some people accepted that framing, as if facts mattered less than the smooth confidence with which they were delivered. The strain began to creep into David's daily life. Each time he stepped into his yard, he felt exposed, aware that neighbors could be watching, wondering if the quiet architect was really the troublemaker in this dispute. Even his evening walks past the flattened site carried a sense of humiliation, a reminder that something he had cherished had been stolen not only physically but also in meaning. To make matters worse, Mark had taken to leaving his bulldozer parked conspicuously near the property line, its bulk looming like a taunt, the engine sometimes left idling just long enough for David to notice. When their eyes met across the distance, Mark would raise a hand in a mock-friendly wave, his grin infuriating in its deliberate provocation. Though David tried to maintain composure, the erosion of his boundaries weighed on him. He began compiling everything he could find. Old surveys, photographs, receipts from when he purchased the land, even sketches of the barn from his notebooks. He stored them carefully in a binder, aware that the time would come when he would have to present them before officials or a judge. Yet at night, when the house grew quiet and the fields outside lay in darkness, he wrestled with doubts. Could Mark be right about discrepancies in boundary lines? Was it possible that the barn, standing for decades, had been built in the wrong place? And if so, would that justify what had been done? Or would the law still recognize it as his property destroyed without consent? One evening, as he was sorting through papers at his kitchen table, a knock sounded on the door. Mark stood there holding a manila folder, his expression falsely pleasant. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside and set the folder on the table. Inside were photocopies of survey maps, highlighted in thick marker to suggest that the barn had overlapped onto his land. "Just trying to keep things transparent," Mark said, his voice coated with mock civility. "I know you're upset, but you can see how confusing this all looks. Boundaries around here were never clear. Maybe you should think twice before dragging me into court. It'll only waste your time." David studied the documents and recognized instantly that something was off. The maps were poorly copied, certain dates smudged, and one bore an official stamp so faint it looked more like an inkjet print than an original seal. He looked up to meet Mark's eyes, which glittered with challenge. "These aren't accurate," David said firmly, sliding the folder back across the table. "And this doesn't change what you did." For a flicker of a moment, Mark's smile faltered, revealing the irritation beneath. But he recovered quickly and leaned on the chair back with casual arrogance. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't try to work this out neighbor to neighbor. Once lawyers get involved, things can get messy." He tapped the folder twice, then left, whistling as he walked down the path. The encounter left David shaken, not because the threats intimidated him, but because he now understood the lengths to which his neighbor was prepared to go. It was not enough that the barn had been demolished. Mark wanted to rewrite the very reality of the situation, to fabricate evidence and weave a story that might withstand casual scrutiny. David's binder of documents suddenly felt fragile in comparison, a defense he would have to wield with precision against someone who had already proven shameless. That night, he sat long after midnight at his drafting table, staring at the blank page, unable to sketch anything. The barn had once been a source of inspiration, a structure that whispered resilience. Now its absence had become the center of a battle, and the lines of that battle were already being drawn in lies, in insinuations, and in the uneasy silence of neighbors who preferred convenience over truth. David knew that the first confrontation had passed, but the escalation had only just begun, and whatever came next would demand more resolve than he had ever needed in his life as an architect. The morning that David finally decided to drive downtown to the county archive began with an uneasy stillness, as though the very air around his house held its breath. He had spent the previous week gathering everything he owned that might serve as proof of the barn's rightful place on his land. But each evening, the sight of Mark's heavy equipment parked smugly at the edge of the property had gnawed at his certainty. It was not simply the loss of the structure that weighed on him, but the feeling that he was being slowly pushed into a corner, not just legally but psychologically, as though every casual smirk and every rumor seeded among the neighbors was designed to erode his confidence before the real fight even began. By the time he reached the records office, a squat brick building that smelled of dust and old paper, his jaw was tight with resolve. Inside, he explained his situation to a clerk whose tired eyes softened with the faintest trace of sympathy. She disappeared into the back and returned with several bound survey books and microfilm records, the kind that bore the weight of decades. David spent hours combing through them, tracing lines on faded maps with his finger, comparing parcel numbers, noting the changes that had occurred as farmland was gradually divided into residential plots. His patience was rewarded when he uncovered an original survey dated 1946, which included not only the borders of his property but a marked structure precisely where the barn had stood. The ink was faded but legible, the seal of the surveyor embossed into the corner of the page. It was not just a piece of evidence. It was confirmation that the barn had always belonged where it was, that it had not crept across boundaries like some parasite, but had been rooted firmly in his land since long before Mark Peterson had even been born. Relief coursed through him, tempered quickly by the realization that this was only one step in a longer war. He carefully requested certified copies of the documents and tucked them into a portfolio. On his way back, he stopped at a local diner for coffee, and as he sat there flipping through the copies once more, he caught sight of Mark across the street, leaning against his truck and talking to two men. Mark's gestures were broad, his voice loud enough to carry, and though David could not hear the words, he could see the way the men nodded, the way they glanced toward him through the window. Mark noticed him watching and raised a hand in exaggerated greeting, his smile too wide, too polished. It was then that David realized the battle was not going to be fought quietly. That evening he called a local attorney whose name he had found through a referral, a woman named Laura Bennett who specialized in property disputes. When he laid out his story, her silence was not the dismissive kind he had encountered at the police station, but the kind of pause that comes from measuring the scope of a problem. She asked for copies of the documents, listened carefully as he described the sequence of events, and finally said, "What your neighbor did is not a misunderstanding. It's a calculated act, and the forged documents he presented you with prove intent. But you need to be prepared for how this will play out. These disputes can drag on, and men like him thrive on the delay. The good news is you now have something concrete, the original survey. That gives us leverage." For the first time since the demolition, David felt a flicker of reassurance. Yet even as Laura spoke, he knew that leverage was only valuable if it could withstand the relentless assault of manipulation and lies. The next morning, that truth arrived in the form of another letter slipped under his door, this time claiming that he was in violation of local building codes for maintaining a hazardous structure without proper authorization. The irony of being accused of maintaining something that no longer existed would have been laughable if not for the unmistakable fingerprints of Mark's influence. Attached to the letter was a photocopy of a complaint supposedly filed with the county inspector's office, signed with a scrawl that David strongly suspected belonged to his neighbor. Determined not to allow intimidation to dictate the terms, David drove to the inspector's office himself. After a long wait in a sterile hallway, he was ushered in to see a middle-aged man who confirmed, with a slight frown, that no such complaint had been officially filed. The letter David presented was, in the inspector's words, not something that originated from our office. It was another fabrication. That discovery carried with it a strange blend of satisfaction and dread. Satisfaction that Mark's attempts at deception were unraveling under scrutiny. Dread because each forged letter revealed a man willing to escalate without hesitation, without conscience. When he returned home that evening, headlights swept across his driveway and a pickup pulled to a stop. For a moment, he braced himself. But it was not Mark. It was an older neighbor, Thomas Reed, who had lived in the area long before most of the newer developments appeared. He stepped out slowly, leaning on his cane, and said in a voice both weary and direct, "I heard what happened. I remember that barn. Been standing there longer than some of these houses. Don't let Peterson tell you otherwise." From the pocket of his jacket, he produced a small envelope containing black and white photographs, snapshots of the land from decades earlier, one of which clearly showed the barn in place with the old fencing, that aligned perfectly with the 1946 survey. David accepted the photographs with gratitude that words could not quite convey. They were more than corroboration. They were testimony rooted in lived memory, impossible to counterfeit. As Thomas drove away, David understood that while Mark had succeeded in bending some opinions with his bluster, there were still those who recognized the truth and were willing to stand beside him. Later that night, David spread the documents, the survey, and the photographs across his dining table. For the first time, he could see the outline of a case forming, something solid enough to withstand the smoke and mirrors his neighbor kept producing. But with that clarity came a new unease, because each piece of evidence felt like a flare in the darkness, a signal that the conflict was now fully exposed. Mark had tested his resolve by erasing the barn, by fabricating invoices, by twisting the opinions of others. Now that David had begun to fight back with proof, the struggle would only intensify. He sat back in his chair, staring at the space where the barn once stood, visible through the window as a scar of flat earth under the moonlight. What had once been a private sanctuary was now a battlefield, and the midpoint of that battle was here. He no longer questioned whether Mark's demolition had been a mistake, but recognized it as deliberate, premeditated, and malicious. The fight was no longer about nostalgia or architectural vision. It was about truth itself, and about whether decency could survive when confronted with arrogance sharpened into weaponry. The weeks that followed the discovery of the old survey and the photographs did not bring relief, but instead marked the beginning of a darker turn in the conflict. David had believed, perhaps naively, that exposing the forged documents and presenting irrefutable evidence of the barn's rightful place would weaken Mark's resolve. But he quickly learned that people who thrive on deception are not discouraged by proof. They simply raise the stakes. It began with small but unmistakable signs of intrusion. A stack of broken boards, obviously from the demolished barn, appeared overnight at the edge of his driveway as if to mock him with the ruins of what had been stolen. Spray-painted across one of the planks in thick red strokes was a crude message: "You owe me." David stood staring at it in the morning light, the paint still glistening slightly, and understood that his neighbor was no longer satisfied with bending. Perceptions through charm and gossip. Now he was testing how far intimidation could reach. He reported the incident, filing a complaint and showing the photograph of the vandalism. But the deputy who came to take his statement shrugged in that familiar way that suggested such acts were difficult to prove. Without direct evidence tying Mark to the graffiti, the matter was reduced to an entry in a file, another note buried in the bureaucracy that seemed designed to wear him down. Yet David could feel the hostility pressing closer each night. He began to notice unfamiliar tire tracks cutting across the dirt near his property line, as though trucks had been pulling in deliberately to leave marks. Once he found a length of rusted chain tossed across his front steps. None of it was overtly threatening enough to provoke official action, but the cumulative effect was corrosive, each act a whisper of menace. Mark, for his part, maintained his veneer of good humor in public. At neighborhood gatherings, he continued to tell the story of the hazardous shack he had helpfully removed, portraying himself as a man unfairly maligned for doing the right thing. David avoided those gatherings, unwilling to fuel the performance, but that only gave Mark more room to speak unopposed. He even began suggesting to others that David was preparing to sue the entire neighborhood for imagined grievances, a lie that spread with alarming ease in a community that preferred harmony, however false, over confrontation. David could sense the shift in the way people looked at him, the polite but cautious nods, the subtle distance they now maintained. At the same time, Mark escalated legally as well. Another letter arrived, this one far more formal, on letterhead that bore the name of a local contractor. It outlined supposed costs incurred for the demolition, an inflated sum that included absurd charges such as site preparation, hazard containment, and labor overtime, each figure carefully chosen to push the total into tens of thousands of dollars. But when David scrutinized the document, he saw the same telltale inconsistencies as before. The formatting irregular, the signatures suspiciously similar, the official stamp blurred as though photocopied from elsewhere. He brought the letter to Laura Bennett, who examined it with a mixture of exasperation and professional calm. "He's trying to bury you in false paperwork," she said. "The hope is you'll get tired and give in. But this is good. Every forged document adds to the case we're building. What he doesn't realize is that these tactics expose his intent." Despite her reassurance, David could not shake the sense of encroachment. Mark had begun leaving his truck parked closer and closer to the property line, sometimes with its headlights left glaring into David's windows long after dark. Once, when David stepped outside to confront him, Mark simply leaned against the hood, arms crossed, and said in a falsely pleasant tone, "Just making sure everything's safe out here. Wouldn't want any more accidents, would we?" The implication was clear. Accidents could happen again if David didn't fall into line. The tension bled into David's work, his concentration fractured by the constant vigilance he felt compelled to maintain. He installed heavier locks, began documenting every disturbance with photographs, and kept a running log of each incident, a journal that grew longer each day with notes written in a precise, almost clinical hand. Yet beneath the methodical record-keeping lay a gnawing unease, a question that troubled him late at night when the house grew too quiet. How far would Mark be willing to go? If demolishing the barn and forging documents had not satisfied him, if intimidation and rumor still continued, what boundary remained that he would not cross? One evening, as David was sorting through his binder of evidence, he heard the distinct rumble of engines outside. He stepped onto his porch and saw two large trucks idling near the property line, their headlights cutting across the scarred patch of earth where the barn had once stood. For several minutes the trucks remained there, engines throbbing in the darkness before turning away without explanation. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. The ground itself was being contested, his claim to it challenged not only in documents and stories, but in presence, in weight, in steel and wheels and noise. By the time the trucks disappeared, David felt a resolve hardening within him, colder than anger, sharper than fear. He returned to his desk and began organizing the evidence into a sequence that told the story not only of a demolished structure, but of a pattern. The forged invoices, the falsified maps, the harassment, the vandalism, the orchestrated smear. A campaign. Laura was right. The more Mark did, the clearer his intent became. But clarity did not erase the pressure, the feeling of being besieged in his own home. As the night stretched on and the wind rattled against the eaves, David realized the conflict had passed the point of irritation or even violation. It had become a siege, an attempt to crush him not with a single act but with relentless pressure, a tightening coil of lies and intimidation. And though he feared the cost of what lay ahead, he understood that retreat was no longer possible. The second escalation had begun, and there was no turning back. The courthouse was smaller than David expected, a low building of pale stone with narrow windows that gave it the appearance of a place designed less for justice than for keeping trouble contained out of sight. He arrived with his portfolio under one arm, the certified surveys and photographs neatly ordered, and Laura walking steadily at his side. Though her calm demeanor did much to steady him, David could feel the weight of the moment pressing into his chest. Months of intimidation, deception, and the gnawing sense of being isolated in his own neighborhood had all brought him here, to a room where truth would have to be spoken plainly enough to cut through the noise that Mark had worked so hard to create. When they entered, Mark was already seated at the opposite table, his suit slightly ill-fitting, his grin unchanged, as though the entire proceeding were little more than a performance staged for his amusement. He nodded mockingly in David's direction, then leaned in to whisper something to his attorney, a slick man who looked more interested in the stack of billing papers before him than the case itself. The judge entered, and the room shifted into a silence that carried its own gravity. Mark's attorney spoke first, spinning the same story that David had heard whispered around the neighborhood for weeks. The barn had been a hazard, he said, leaning heavily on words like unsafe and dangerous. It had encroached on Mark's land for decades, and his client had acted responsibly by removing a structure that posed both a legal and physical risk. The invoice, he continued, represented nothing more than fair reimbursement for the costs incurred. The performance was smooth, rehearsed, and delivered with enough conviction that David could feel the subtle pull of its logic, the way half-truths often carried more immediate weight than reality. When Laura rose to speak, her voice cut through that veneer with quiet precision. She presented the 1946 survey first, laying it carefully before the judge, then the more recent certified copies, then the black-and-white photographs provided by Thomas Reed. She explained the continuity between them, the unbroken record of the barn's existence precisely within David's property line. Each document, each image, stacked one atop another until the weight of history itself anchored the truth. Then she produced the forged invoices and maps Mark had tried to use, pointing out the irregularities in stamps, signatures, and formatting. "This is not a neighbor acting in good faith," she said firmly. "This is a deliberate attempt to erase property, fabricate evidence, and then profit from the destruction." Mark shifted uneasily but tried to recover, his bravado surfacing again as he interrupted to insist that boundaries were unclear, that everyone in the neighborhood knew the barn leaned dangerously close to his side. The judge silenced him with a raised hand and turned his attention back to the documents. For several tense minutes, the courtroom was filled only with the sound of pages turning, the judge's eyes narrowing as he examined the contrasting sets of evidence. The breaking point came not from the papers, but from Mark himself. Frustrated by the judge's cool scrutiny, he blurted out, "I told him months ago that barn was in my way, that it made it impossible to expand my driveway. He wouldn't listen. What was I supposed to do? Just let it rot there forever?" The silence that followed his outburst was electric, as though the air itself had been stripped bare. In those few sentences, the mask of concern for safety and fairness collapsed, revealing the self-interest that had motivated him all along. Laura did not need to press further. She simply repeated his words for the record, letting them hang in the air beside the surveys and photographs. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable for a long moment, and then he spoke. He declared that the evidence showed the barn had stood entirely on David's land, that the destruction of it had been unlawful, and that the forged documents submitted by Mark further undermined any claim to good faith. The request for reimbursement was dismissed in its entirety, and the matter was referred for review of possible criminal charges relating to the falsified materials. David sat motionless as the words sank in, the tension that had coiled inside him for months releasing in a slow, trembling breath. Across the room, Mark's grin was gone, replaced by a thin line of disbelief, his face pale as the implications landed. For the first time, David saw not arrogance but the flicker of a man cornered by his own lies. When the gavel fell, the sound carried more weight than he expected. It was not merely a decision. It was a vindication, the clear assertion that what had been stolen from him was not just a building, but the truth itself. And, for once, truth had prevailed. When David returned home from the courthouse, the evening light was falling across the empty patch of earth where the barn had once stood, and for the first time in many months the sight did not fill him with dread, but with a quiet sense of vindication. The scar remained, wide and raw, but it no longer felt like a wound that could be used against him. Instead, it was simply space, a place awaiting transformation, no longer burdened by the lies and intimidation that had surrounded it. Word of the judgment spread quickly through the neighborhood, and although some avoided his gaze, unwilling to admit how easily they had been swayed by Mark's story, others stopped by with cautious words of support. Even the silence of those who had once whispered against him felt like a victory, for the foundation of rumor had collapsed the moment Mark's own words betrayed him in court. David knew the ordeal was not entirely finished. Compensation would still need to be negotiated, and the question of charges for falsified documents remained with the authorities. Yet the essential battle had been decided, and he no longer carried the weight of proving himself to people eager to doubt. He began sketching again in the evenings, not the same barn that had been lost, but a new structure, modern yet rooted in the same spirit, a workshop of glass and timber that would rise where the old one had stood. He imagined it as both a personal retreat and a place where he might welcome others, proof that something destroyed in arrogance could be remade in strength. Sometimes, standing at the edge of the field, he thought of the way Mark had grinned when he first confessed to the demolition, so certain that intimidation and bluster would be enough to secure compliance. Now the bulldozer was gone, the false documents discredited, and the grin replaced by silence. What lingered for David was not bitterness but a sharpened sense of vigilance, a recognition that resilience was not born in isolation, but in the decision to defend what mattered even when the path grew narrow. The land was his, the truth had prevailed, and the barn, though gone, had given him something lasting, the knowledge that even in the face of erasure, he had not yielded.